Let's go.
Let's go.
Oh, did you want to?
Sorry, I'll let you.
Next time.
I'm in love with you.
Snap out of it.
I'll have what she's having.
Too many guys think I'm a concept, or I complete them, or I'm gonna make them alive. But I'm just a fucked up girl who's looking for my own peace of mind. Don't assign me yours.
Caustic wit is my religion.
I would make a great queen because I am so stubborn.
I say when it comes to stardom and Lauren, there are no accidents.
Hi, Karen Peterson.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 162 of Citizen Dame, the podcast where I couldn't think of anything funny to say because I'm really tired and it's Saturday and I was up really late watching Lois Weber films. So there you go. I'm Karen Peterson, joined as always by my amazing co-host, Lauren Humphreys-Brooks.
Hello.
Lauren, how are you?
I'm doing all right on this gray overcast. Since we do the weather report every day, this gray overcast, kind of breezy, actually kind of nice day in Brooklyn. You know, it's nice things have cooled off a little bit. It was very hot during the week.
Yeah, I heard it was. Here it is beautiful blue skies. There's not a cloud in sight, and it's 68 degrees. I think the high is like 76. So,
oh, that sounds lovely.
Perfect California day.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, let's get into it. First of all, we wanted to jump back into our discussion from last week because we spent the next 2 days after we recorded going, hey, we forgot this movie. We forgot that movie. And so we thought we should jump back into that. So first of all, one of the big misses that we did not cover last week in our Pride episode was Some Like It Hot. And you were the first one to point that out. So...
Well, I was listening to the episode because I was editing it, and when the question about studio system Hollywood, classical Hollywood came up, I was like, how the fuck did we not mention Some Like It Hot? Mm-hmm. A movie in which Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon pretend to be women, and there's
especially when we talked about The Birdcage and we talked about Tu Wong Fu.
Yeah, and granted, there's Some Like It Hot, we're talking about what films get away with a lot. Some Like It Hot gets away with a lot.
Yeah.
By sort of, setting up this kind of thing. We're just like, well, they're not gay. They're dressing like women because they need to be, they need a job, right?
Right. And the reason I said it was weird that we didn't think of it with those other two movies was not because of thematic similarities, but because you have straight actors playing these characters and spending most of the movie dressed as women. That's why. Well,
and it is a very queer film, particularly the relationship between Daphne, right? I was just like, initially she's going to be Geraldine, and then she decides that she's going to be Daphne, and the Joey Brown character, right? Osgood. Mm-hmm. And it's such a funny relationship and everything. But again, the ending, and spoiler alert for anyone who's not seen Some Like It Hot, please, if you haven't, dear God, go see it. But the ending where, he's just like, I'm a man, I can't marry you because I'm a man. That's the reason why we can't have this relationship. And the immediate well, whatever, nobody's perfect. And then that's what they end on, I think is fantastic. But there's no oh no, actually we can't get married or horror. It's just no, Osgood loves him. He loves who he is, and it doesn't matter that he's a man. Yep,
exactly. And it's so great. And it's funny because the first time I watched it, I don't know. I just didn't love it. And not for any particular reason. I just was like, it's fine. I think it was one of those movies that people had talked about it so much for, my whole childhood that I was expecting something different. I don't know. But I've watched it again over the years, and it's funny, and it's now I need to watch it today. That's gonna be my after this podcast is over movie today.
One of the things I really like about it is that it uses this whole MacGuffin, basically. All right, okay, we
Yeah.
have to dress as women because the mob is after us and we need
Right.
a job. And of course, they're never going to look for us in this girl band because it's made up entirely of girls. And so much of the humor is exactly comes from that, and the fact that, you know, the audience knows that they're men, but none of the other people around them know that they're men. But I like the fact that so much of it is about these men coming to understand women and male-female relationships in a very different way, simply by the fact that, you know, they're having to perform as women. So the Tony Curtis's character, his entire arc is realizing that, you know, he cannot behave this way with women because he's actually seeing the way that it affects them.
Yeah.
And understanding that, you know, maybe his attitude and his behavior makes him unworthy of sugar. And that, you know, he eventually says to her at the end, it's just like, no, I'm this bad dude. But then it turns out that he really isn't. And I like that. I like that it's so much about kind of men stepping into women's shoes, and literally, and having to kind of come to terms with their own behavior.
Yeah, and I think that's why it works so well. I mean, it's really funny, but it has some really important points to make. And I think that this is something we're going to talk a little bit about when we get into Lois Weber's films today. But, you know, one of the things I love in Some Like It Hot and just in some other films too, is the way that stepping literally sometimes into someone else's shoes is the only way to really understand their perspective. Like sometimes we just, because of our attitudes, because of our lives, because of whatever, we cannot. And I mean, like, we just don't, you know, like sometimes we really, really, truly can't. But mostly it's that we can't allow ourselves to think about something in a really, truly empathetic way until we experience what they have experienced.
Yeah. And I like also that really Jerry, right, who becomes Daphne, that becomes who he is. Like, it's like he's suddenly come into his own of just like, oh, this is the person that I've always wanted to be, or that I've always been. And so there is that like transgressive element to it. There's a great line where like Joe's saying like, well, why would a guy want to marry a guy? And he says security. Like it doesn't even cross his mind that this might not be possible. He's just like, well, you know, his mother might not like me, but I think that I can convince her, but it doesn't really worry me because I don't smoke. It's like, you're a man. Like, this is not something that's acceptable in this society. And yet the thing that he's worried about is just like, well, I'm not worried because I don't smoke. No, that's not the thing that his mother's going to be concerned about.
Yep, exactly.
And it is a wonderful film. It is a very queer film, and definitely one of those. It was so popular too, and definitely one of those that, you know, made a lot of inroads, partially by treating it as a joke. It's sort of like, this is a comedy, this is funny, you know, isn't it funny? We've got these two very masculine men, right, dressing up as women, and sort of the screwball nature of what ensues after that. But it manages to be very, very transgressive because it uses the comedy as an excuse.
Yeah, well, and I think that there are a lot of great films that do similar things, where it's like you almost trick the audience into feeling empathy for a group of people that they wouldn't necessarily normally feel anything for.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, you can get away with a lot. You play, oh, it's just a joke.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, well, but it really, that's how Mae West got away with as much as she did. Well, it's just a joke, you know.
Yeah,
they don't
exactly.
really ever say anything that's wrong. You're putting an interpretation on that. Like, and it's just like, but you know that she's actually getting away with a great deal.
Right. Yeah. Well, Some Like It Hot is available to watch on Prime Video and Hoopla and Tubi. So if you have not watched it, or if it's been a while, you have some options to watch it again. Is there any other ones? I feel like there were a couple of others that we were going to talk about.
Well, we also wanted to mention that we got a question about Dog Day Afternoon, which we failed to answer yesterday. Sorry, we're really sorry about that. It was down further on our agenda and we just missed it. That's from @Noah_Saturn. Would you consider Dog Day Afternoon part of queer cinema? I don't know how to answer that, because I don't know enough of the history of Dog Day Afternoon to be able to say it. I mean, the kind of turn that film takes is that it turns out the reason why the Al Pacino character is pulling off this bank heist, or trying to, is because he wants to get enough money to help his transgender, and I don't think they use the term transgender, they might use the term transsexual. I can't remember exactly how they refer to it.
In the 70s, it's probably transsexual, yeah.
So to help his lover get a sex change operation, and so that's part of it. I don't know how to say whether or not this is part of queer cinema. It definitely has queer themes in it, and it treats of both of them as very sympathetic in that sense. Like, I don't know exactly whether to say that this is part of queer cinema. I think that a lot of people would consider it that because it has an explicitly queer plot thread.
Yeah. Well, and my feeling on this is like, because I looked at a lot of, I did a little bit of research to see what other people had to say, and it does land on a lot of lists from people in the LGBTQ plus community. And so for me, it's like, well, I don't know. I'm with you. I don't know that I would particularly say, oh yes, this definitely is. But if other people are saying it, I'm not going to tell them they're wrong.
Well, and there's this whole thing, part of that subplot is also about that he considers his lover his wife. And that they had a marriage ceremony and all this, so that there is that element to it. Now, on the other side of it, he's also already married. Right. To a woman, and has got several children, and there's this whole thing that's going on in the background that is kind of a left turn in some ways in terms of the film itself, because you don't entirely expect this to be kind of the background to it, but it is treated in a fairly sensitive way, particularly for the time period.
Yeah. So I guess the answer is sure. I don't know.
I think
yes.
Yeah, this seems to be something that comes up a lot, and definitely in terms of queer representation on screen, it's one of the more prevalent ones.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, any others before we move on to the great Lois Weber?
I want to talk about him more in depth at some point, but we did fail to mention John Waters last week.
Oh, yeah.
is just unforgivable. Yes, John Waters is kind of the high king of queer cinema. So.
Yeah, we should probably at some point do just a whole episode about him down the road when I've had time to watch more of his films. I've seen like 3.
A whole bunch are on Criterion.
Yeah, they are.
Especially some of those early ones. I think you can watch Pink Flamingos and Female Trouble and Multiple Maniacs, which I'm sorry, I did not like. I know what he's doing, but I'm just like, this has crossed several lines for me. Which it's supposed to. You know what? It's supposed to. Those films that he, particularly his very early films, they're supposed to cross multiple lines. So I'm like, all right, it's just not necessarily for me.
Not everything has to be for you, Lauren.
I know it's not, and that's fine. I am okay with that. I absolutely accept that. But yeah, I mean, I love John Waters. He's awesome.
Yeah, I've met him.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I wish I had met him. I got to see him talk at the IFC, but no.
It was very quick. It was very brief. He, where was it? It was a red carpet for something. I think it was the Spirit Awards a couple years ago. Yeah, it was with Kristen. And he just happened to be there, and I think she was the one that got him to stop, and he just came over and chatted for just a minute, but it was just like, oh my gosh, it's John Waters. It was very cool. Alrighty. So new episode about John Waters coming soon. I think is what we've just decided.
Yes.
Cool. All right, so let's shift gears and talk about Lois Weber, who was a film director in the silent film era. At one point, she was the highest paid director in Hollywood, not female director, director. And so she got her start. She was an actress, and she did basically at some point or another did kind of every job in film production. She was a writer, a director, she edited, she produced her movies. So she had quite a lot of experience. They don't actually know how many films she made. It was a lot, but in the early days, that's kind of how it was. Like, people were making a lot of like these short projects, and many of them were destroyed, as we've talked about at length on this podcast. So we have no idea, but some of her films are currently available on the Criterion channel, and I think in some other places too. But yeah, so let's just jump in and start. Where would you like to start?
Well, I mean, I think we should start with Suspense, which is her 1913. It's only about an 11-minute film, but in that film, it's a very simple story, as would be expected from an 11-minute film. Basically, a woman who is home alone. Her husband is at work. He's going to be late, and a tramp, a tramp breaks into her house. And so the entire story is basically the husband rushing home to try to rescue her while she is trapped in an upstairs room with their baby. And so that's the basic plot. And then there are actually some complications. But what's really fascinating about it, I think, is that it was a pioneer use of the split screen technique. So you actually get to see her talking with her husband while the tramp is breaking in. And it isn't just like, talking heads or anything like that. It's actual, frames. And so you see the tramp, lifting, getting the key from the doormat, opening the door and walking into the house. And meanwhile, she's talking to her husband, and her husband's like, oh my God, someone is in the house. I've got to go. And then I think the tramp ends up cutting the phone line. Yep. And so the phone goes dead. And so you get all of this buildup, and it's all happening in very quick succession. And you're watching it all happen in a single frame, which is really remarkable when you're thinking about that. This is 1913. This is not early cinema, but fairly early days of cinema. Cinema as a medium has only been around for about 20 years at this point. And you've got this female director who is just making these massive inroads to what you can do in a very short space of time with the camera. This is pre-sound, so you're not talking about any use of sound or anything like that. It's just developing the story in this very rapid succession.
Yeah, it's funny, just jumping back a little bit. It's funny because this week I read something where someone referred to Lois Weber as one of the first auteur directors. And then I just started thinking about, because I was reading up a little bit. I love Suspense. It's a great film, and it's amazing how much they pack into 11 minutes and how suspenseful it really is. But I was just thinking about how much she's able to do with that film and just with the camera. And I started imagining, like, if someone were to Bill and Ted style go back in time, pick her up and bring her to now, like what she would think of film today and how far it's come and what's possible nowadays and what kind of movies she'd be making now. I don't know. I was just having a little fun going down that rabbit hole, but just thinking about like her and Chloe Zhao having a conversation about movies, I think would be so cool. But yeah, Suspense, like you mentioned the split screen, but she also just does some really interesting things, and in other films too. Like, she just does really interesting things with the camera. Like, there's the scene where the woman, the mother, looks out the window and she looks down and she sees this tramp on the back porch about to like try to come into her house, and it's from overhead and he just looks straight up, and there's just something like so creepy about that moment for me. Like, it got me, and I was just like, this is so well done. And with the music, the music is just perfect. Really good score to just help bring it home. But it's like in 11 minutes you have a housekeeper quitting her job, you've got a woman and her baby in danger, you've got a police chase because the husband steals a car to get home to his wife. That. Yeah, it's great.
Well, and one of the interesting things I think about all of that is that it, this is a film called Suspense, but it is actually a great sort of template for how suspense works in cinema. Mm-hmm. So you've got first of all, you've got a whole bunch of information that the viewer has that the characters themselves don't have. So the housekeeper quitting, right? The housekeeper leaves and leaves a note and says, okay, I'm leaving because this house is too isolated or something like that. Yeah. So you've got a lot of so you establish the fact that this is a very isolated house, that no one else is in the house other than this woman and her baby, right? You set that up within like a couple of seconds, basically.
And also that she's leaving the key under the mat.
Yeah, so you know where the key is. We've established how the tramp is going to get into the house, that the key is going to become important, all of those things. But meanwhile, the mother doesn't know that this has happened, right? She's just upstairs with her baby. She's got no clue that now she is vulnerable and in danger.
Right.
And by the same token, when you get the tramp cutting the phone line and the husband no longer, being able to talk to his wife, he doesn't know what's happening. So the viewer is aware of all of these different things, but the characters aren't. And that's where kind of they begin to build the tension. That you've got this kind of kinetic through plot moving, and exactly, so again, the mother can't know that the tramp is walking up the stairs, but we see the tramp walking up the stairs. So you get all of these different perspectives. And as a result, it creates suspense, right? It's the same thing with, the cops. So the husband runs out and steals a car, and then the guy is like, hey, he stole my car. So then the cops are chasing after.
Right. Because they have no idea why he stole the car.
Exactly. But so this entire time, and as the viewer, you're like, oh my God, if the cops catch him, right, then he's not going to get home in time. But if they don't catch him and they follow him all the way back home, then they'll be able to save her, right? So you have all of this great establishment of all these questions and establishment of characters and everything that is going to happen in this film. And again, when you're saying 11 minutes worth of film, that's remarkable when you really think about it.
Yeah. It's such a testament to not just Lois Weber, but the early pioneers of cinema in general, and just how, they were figuring out how this medium works in a time when they didn't include talking. So it's like, they, a novel, you kind of know, and novels have existed for hundreds of years. And so you can, what you can do with a novel. Every once in a while you read one now that's still just like, wow, that was amazing. But it's more about like, that's amazing writing, not, wow, that's such an innovative way to tell a story, usually, but with the early days of film, they're trying to figure out how to tell stories, which we've been telling stories as humans since there were humans, but in such a new way, and trying to figure out what worked and what didn't. And I think that's part of why there's, so many directors were making hundreds of films, because they were just playing around with things. But what she accomplished in Suspense, what she accomplishes in some of her other films too, even when there's these short films, it really is so innovative. And this is something that I know Fritzy from Movie Silently, and also Nanina and you like have talked a lot about how, everyone wants to give Griffith all this credit for all the innovations that he made in cinema, but there are so many people like Lois Weber that were doing it even before he was.
At the time, you have people like DeMille and Griffith and Weber. All of them were working at about the same time, and they are very innovative. And I don't think that we should ignore the fact that Griffith was innovative in a lot of ways, but his importance in cinematic history has been severely overrated.
Yeah.
Where meanwhile, we're denigrating kind of the innovations made by someone like Lois Weber. I mean, if you had asked me who Lois Weber was 5 years ago, I could not have told you. And that's embarrassing in a lot of ways, but that's also like, I went to film school. I have a master's degree in film. This was just never anyone that we talked about. Particularly, we talked about Griffith, but we didn't talk about Lois Weber. And that's unforgivable, really, because she has been marginalized. She's been largely written out of cinematic history until fairly recently. But you've got these major innovators. All of them are working at the same time. They're kind of playing off of each other. They're riffing on each other. They're working in the same studio for large sections of their careers. And the fact that, we've written out one of the few women, I think says a lot. I mean, like you said, this is woman. She was the highest paid director at Universal in like 1916. This is a studio that at the time also included Cecil B. DeMille.
Right.
So you're talking about an incredibly successful director who has just not been given her due, right?
Yeah.
So this is not someone who's marginalized at the time even. She was very valued at the time, and then things shifted. But we have failed to value her.
Yeah. So I have been reading this book. It's not very thick, but the printing is tiny, so it's taking me a while to read it because there's a lot in here. But it's called Pink Slipped: What Happened to Women in the Silent Film Industries by Jane M. Gaines. And it's interesting because obviously Lois Weber comes up a bunch in this, but we've talked before about how women sort of were the backbone of the early film, and like there were a lot of women working in film, and not just in costume and makeup, but in writing and producing and directing. And it's interesting, there's a quote in here. So in 1928, after she'd kind of already been pushed out of the system, she gave an interview in the San Diego Evening Tribune, and she's talking specifically about how, so it's I wish that I could find the article. Like I wish I could look that up, because I'd love to know what the actual question was that she was answering. But she talks about women and men directing, and she says, personally, I grew up with the business when everybody was so busy learning their particular branch of a new industry that the box office was all that counted. And so it wasn't even about like, oh, women are directing these movies and men are directing those. It was just, as long as you were making money for the studio, they didn't really care who was making the movie, which is funny because now we've gotten to this point of like, well, women aren't bankable, and they're starting to come back around that they are. But for decades that was one of the excuses, is that women's films don't make money. And for Lois Weber, she's sitting there saying like, well, back in the early days they didn't really care as long as you were. And part of that I found myself wondering like, well, did she not notice what was happening to other women because she was making the most money sometimes, and so she like her movies were really bankable? Or you know what I mean? Like, yeah. So I don't know. It was interesting.
I mean, even within this time period, there were a lot of female directors, as we've talked about, and as we've been able to observe. She was definitely one of the most successful ones of this period. And some of that
did that change her perspective? Like, did that alter her ability to see what was going on outside of what her experience was?
Yeah, I'm certain that it did. At the same time, she is right. She's saying, that this when she was kind of at the height of her career, it was a very nascent industry. It was a question of how long film was going to last. I mean, there was still sort of an attitude that film was a gimmick, right? Mm-hmm. That this was a fad that was eventually going to vanish. And then at a certain point, it became, a much bigger, stronger, heavier industry. But I find it hard to believe that she didn't notice that she was slowly pushed out in favor of male directors.
Oh yeah.
That other women in the same positions because basically the industry became more streamlined, and the more streamlined it became, the more men took over. And as we've observed historically, women have been kind of relegated to a niche, right? So we talk about female directors. Well, really, we should be talking about directors.
Yeah, exactly. It's not, directing is not a gendered role. It's not a gendered job.
Well, I think it's funny.
Nothing is, but
I think it's Alice Guy Blaché actually wrote an op-ed that was literally about how being a director, women are better at directing films than men are. And it was because, and it was very gendered, you know, in the sense that a director has to sort of take care of everybody and be kind to everyone and sort of manage. It's like a household. So there's very much this sort of, you know, domestic almost element that's running through. But I thought it was really funny that she was like, oh, women are naturally better suited to be directors than men.
You know what's funny is, like, I've heard, like, when I've interviewed people for my work, I've actually had actors and behind the scenes, like, crafts people tell me also that they, like, when I've interviewed for, say, a movie directed by a woman and the subject will come up, and I've had them say something kind of similar, but it's more on the lines of, like, women are just better at being in charge. Like, they're not gonna take things personally. They're just gonna tell you, like, this is what you need to do, and they're better organized than men are, and they're less emotional about it.
They're less emotional. Ooh.
Yeah, actually, Justin Thoreau said that.
Who? It's a throwback, everybody. I don't know whether anyone would remember some of this, but. No, but I do think that there's an argument definitely to be made about socialization, because and so that's not necessarily saying that women are biologically more capable, right?
No,
but definitely we know that women are socialized differently than men, and if you grow up being socialized as a woman, you have a different attitude towards certain things than you do if you grow up being socialized as a man. So I definitely would agree with that, because, and I think that also there's got to be an element in the film industry itself, because as we've observed, women are scrutinized, female directors are scrutinized far more than male directors. You know, we've observed that someone like Catherine Hardwicke, who talked about how when she was filming Twilight, she would sometimes have difficulties and she would, like, go off and cry for a few minutes. Yeah. And that it was helpful to kind of get her emotions out. And that this became one of the reasons that the studio gave for her not being rehired for the next films. Meanwhile, David O. Russell is screaming and throwing things at his stars to the point that George Clooney wants to kill him. Yeah. But he keeps
in fact, I think punched him in the face.
Yes. I mean, and not to get off topic on that, but there is definitely, like, this attitude. So women do, in that sense, female directors do have to be more apparently in control of their emotions, because if you break down and cry, oh my God, well, she's a woman, women can't handle this. Yeah. But, you know, if a male director throws something at a star's head, well, he's just a passionate,
he's an artist, and artists are troubled people.
He's a genius or whatever. So I think that there's definitely socialization, and also the awareness of the requirements of the industry and the way that the industry treats men and women differently is definitely a part of that.
Yeah, for sure. But it's, you know, I wish that I had done a little bit more research. I've been trying to look at some stuff for Lois Weber, as I would like to know or find some interviews of, you know, back in the time after she was kind of getting pushed out, more of, like, did she talk about that experience? How did she feel about losing out on opportunities to men after she had made so much money for the studio? And, you know, she also died young. I mean, I guess it wasn't that young for the time. She died at 60.
I mean, that's still fairly young. And I think at one point there was a film that she was supposed to make, and then she made some objections to some of the jokes as being racist. And basically she was fired, and they brought on, among other people, they brought on D.W. Griffith to
Of
finish
course they
things up.
did.
So,
Because he didn't object to racism.
well,
He probably said, this movie doesn't have enough racism. Let's do more.
it's just like, there's a joke about throwing a black baby into a trash can. Why don't we light the trash can on fire?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh.
D.W. Griffith was a racist. Like, I don't care. You can try to make arguments about intolerance or whatever. It's like, no, he was a fucking racist. He was explicitly racist.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Anyway, so yeah, Lois Weber, she's awesome, and she made some good movies. And let's see, so she goes from suspense, which she actually co-directed with her husband at the time, and she starred in it as the wife. But she does a bunch of films, co-directing a lot of them with her husband. Let's see, what are some other ones that that you would like to talk about?
Well, I think in terms of this issue of social issues, because a lot of her films deal with issues that she felt were important, that social problems. She made films about income inequality, about poverty, about I do want to talk about The Blot in a minute, but
yeah, definitely.
I don't know if you've seen this film, but I think that it's one that comes up a lot when she's discussed, because it's one of her most successful films, but it's also one of her most, certainly from a contemporary standpoint, her most problematic, which is Where Are My Children?
Which I have not seen, no.
So this I actually got to see in when they were doing, Kino was doing the Pioneers Female Filmmakers, and they showed a whole bunch of the films at Brooklyn Academy of Music. So I got to see this film on the big screen with piano accompaniment, which was really cool. But this is the film that she made about abortion. And it's a problematic film. There is no doubt about that. Because one of basically the plot is that a famous lawyer is prosecuting a doctor for doing illegal abortions. And what he discovers in this process is that his wife is among one of many society women who has gone to this doctor to have an abortion. And so that kind of sets off this whole thing. And a lot of it, unfortunately, the film relies very heavily on eugenics and this idea that there are women who are having basically frivolous abortions. So these rich women who can certainly afford to have children, right, and have nothing stopping them from having children, are nonetheless getting abortions because they don't want to deal with it. Meanwhile, one of the arguments that the film makes is that abortion should be available, but it should only be available to poor people. or to people, and so it is a eugenicist argument. But one of the interesting things that I think the film does actually address, beyond the problematic elements, is that there's an entire subplot of the maid of this husband and wife who has, and if I remember correctly, she has an affair with the wife's brother, who basically seduces her, and she gets pregnant. And so you have this situation where there's this young woman who has been who's been seduced by this older, richer man who doesn't want to have anything to do with her, really. He just wanted to sleep with her. And is now in a situation where she's going to have a child, she's going to lose her job, she's going to lose her social standing. Well, little she has, there's all kinds of problems. And so basically she goes to the wife, who takes her to this doctor. And so, although by no means am I saying, or should I be saying, that the eugenicist argument makes sense, but one of the issues that comes from the film is this whole thing of poor people and people without means having more and more children and destroying themselves in the process. And particularly in the case of this maid, who then has this abortion and gets sick because it's a back alley abortion and it's dangerous. So there are all of these other problems that kind of come out of that. So it actually, it's a more nuanced conversation. The film allows for a more nuanced conversation than just rich people should have children and poor people shouldn't. So it's undoubtedly a problematic film, but it actually treats this issue in a very complex way and in a very sympathetic way. In fact, I would say that the film doesn't really come down on an anti-abortion angle. It comes down on abortion should be legal and should be safe.
Right.
Because one of the problems that kind of comes out of all of everything that's happening is that it's something that is being concealed.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's being concealed and because it's illegal, it's dangerous. So these women are getting hurt or they're dying as a result of having these dangerous abortions.
Yeah. Well, and this is one of those things where, you know, we talk about it all the time, but people need to watch more movies and they need to watch older movies, because there's sort of this weird attitude that, like, oh, abortion didn't become an issue that people talked about until like the 60s or 70s. And this is something that's been going on for centuries. And looking at films, even from the earliest part of cinema, where you talk about any sort of social issues, it's interesting because now we're looking at these movies are 100 years old and we're still having conversations about some of the same topics.
I mean, you're talking about a film that was made in 1916.
Yeah.
By a female director.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it has problems and it has questionable elements, very, very much so. But it is actually a serious and complicated treatment of the issue of abortion and the dangers of it and the dangers of it not being legal.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then you have, like, this is what I'm, so like, then last year we had the movie Never, Rarely, Sometimes, Always, which is about a 17-year-old girl who's having to try to navigate a lot of bureaucracy to try to get something that now is legal, but there's still a lot of difficulty attached to being able to do something that is technically legal. And it's just interesting that, you know, 100 years apart, both by female directors, we're still having similar conversations, I guess is the point I was trying to make.
Yeah. I mean, Lois Weber, I think in the next year, she made a film that is now lost that's called The Hand That Rocks the Cradle. And it's based on Margaret Sanger, and it's about accessibility to birth control. And it is, according to all the information that we have about it, it is heavily supportive of women having access to reasonable birth control. And actually the working title of the film, I loved this. The working title of the film was Is a Woman a Person?
Wow. I don't know. Did they ever answer that question?
But so, you know, again, you've got a film that is sadly lost that was made by a female director in the early part of the 20th century, for God's sake, that is actually dealing with these specific questions that we're still fighting over, you know, and we need to be able to go back to those and to see the problems in them, but to also see how that discussion was important in that period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, and there were a lot of social issues that she addressed. And this is, you know, people like to have those conversations of like, is film inherently political? Like, even back in the beginning of time, yes, it was. It always has been. But she talks a lot about other issues, particularly, I watched the ones that are on Criterion right now. So there's a lot of other films of hers that I haven't seen, but you know, in addition to abortion, she talks a lot about poverty, about income inequality, a lot of she has 5 films that are on Criterion right now. And it's interesting how each of them deals with social problems, and all of them deal with that in different ways. So let's see, what's the next one we should talk about? We could talk about Shoes.
Let's talk about Shoes, because Shoes is kind of you know, you if you're talking about income inequality and particularly poverty and
what it drives people to do.
Yeah, and focalizing again through female characters. I mean, not all of her films, but a large majority of her films actually focus on the female characters, even when male characters are important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Shoes was from 1916, and it's about a young woman who's working in like a five and dime type store. And so she's poor, her family's poor, and she doesn't have money for new shoes, and she really, really needs new shoes. They've got holes in them. She's trying to fix them with pieces of cardboard, and it's bad. And so she ends up resorting to prostitution to pay for new shoes.
Yeah, and I like that, again, I like that the film deals with a whole bunch of different issues. So she can't afford it, her family can't afford it, right? Mm-hmm. In order to live, they actually need for her to have the new shoes, because at one point she gets sick. Yeah. Right. And so she's sick. Meanwhile, she's, I think, the only income at that point that is coming into their family. So they are dependent upon her having a job. Well, she can't work if she's sick.
Right. Yeah. Well, and because it's her parents and her, and she's got two sisters.
Three younger sisters. Yeah. There's a little one and then two slightly older ones.
Yeah. Yeah, and so they're relying on her, and so she's desperate. And I feel like what's really interesting about this film is that it really does make her so sympathetic. It's not a film where it's like, oh, what a terrible person that, like, she just resorted to this, you know. It really does bring out, it shows her humanity. And I feel like so many of Lois Weber's films do that, where she draws on empathy of the audience by really making you feel for this woman and understanding, like, pardon the pun, but or the expression, but you kind of are in her shoes, because you're experiencing her feelings, her fears, her desperation right along with her. And so it's easy to not judge her when she makes the choices that she makes, because you're like, well, what would I do in that situation?
Yeah, and it does, I mean, it does also address the fact that her father is lazy, right? Mm-hmm. Her father, who is just lying around all day reading. Yeah. He's not going out looking for a job. He's not trying to help, really. So her mother is trying to manage things. And there's this whole thing that gets going where she keeps on asking her mother for money so that she can go and buy the shoes. And her mother's like, well, we can't do it this week, but we have to do it next week. And it's not because her mother is being frivolous. Her mother's like, this is between you getting shoes and us eating.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
And of course, eating is more important.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it does so well at portraying, like you say, portraying that desperation and how important something so small is, because most of us don't think about, you know, having shoes. Well, mm-hmm. Just go and get a new pair of shoes if your shoes are bad. But when you're in a situation where it's a choice between that or eating, that desperation and that need is so dire. Yeah. Right. And it's painful. She focuses on those shoes a lot, watching them kind of fall apart, literally on screen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's so many shots of those shoes. She does that a lot in The Blot too. But it's such an easy way to represent extreme poverty, because, you know, when you see someone just kind of out in the world, I don't spend a lot of time looking at people's feet, but when you see someone that's wearing shoes that are just falling apart, you understand that usually it's because they just can't afford another pair. It's such a good visual representation of extreme poverty.
Yeah, it really is. And like you say, it makes the girl so sympathetic. It makes everyone but the father mm-hmm. and the guy that she eventually sleeps with right. are very sympathetic characters, right? The mother is trying to hold everything together. She's trying to take care of herself and her children and everybody, and she knows. One of the things I think is really moving about that film is that nearing the end, when it's obvious she's gotten new shoes, right?
Yeah.
The mother knows what she's done. and she's devastated by it, but it isn't like, how dare you, get out of this house.
You've ruined our family.
Yeah, it's more like, oh my God, I can't believe that you've had to resort to this, my child, all this. Don't tell your father's going to be so angry. But there is more of this sense that she is trying to protect her daughter as much as she can, even as she's horrified by it, but she's not blaming her.
Right. It's more, like you say, it's more about the situation. Like, I'm horrified that my daughter's had to resort to this.
Yeah.
Not, oh, my daughter's a tramp, or whatever. Yeah. But that theme is one that she uses really well again in The Blot, which I think came out the same year.
I think it's slightly later. It's like, The Blot is 1921. I think she.
Sorry, yeah. Shoes is 1916. What was the other one that was? Oh, The Dumb Girl of Poor DC,
which I did not get to see this week. Unfortunately, I have not seen.
I watched it, and it's, it was funny because I was just like, all right, this is based on an opera, and now I really want to see the opera. It's more of a fantasy, like not fantasy, but it's more of like a, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. It's like this epic movie, and it was actually one of the most expensive films that Universal produced in the time period. And it's when Spain was trying to take control of Italy back in the 1700s. And so basically this viceroy gets sent from Spain to Italy to be in charge. And there's this fisher, like this little fishing village. And there's this guy who stands up and says like, okay, well, I'm going to be in charge of the village. And his sister is mute. And she ends up falling in love with this this nobleman who is one of the Spanish people who comes in, and he's disguised. I'm explaining this so badly. He comes into the town in disguise because he just wants to see what the people are like, and they end up meeting, and they have a very steamy sex scene. And it was funny because I was sitting there watching with my roommate, and she was kind of half watching because she was doing something else. And I was just like, wow, that's steamy for 1916. And she's like, why, what's going on? I'm like, that is a fully clothed sex scene.
Wow.
Yeah. She's just like, it was? I'm like, yep. So yeah. But it gets into it basically leads to this uprising, this village revolt against Spain. And it's all the opera is based on a real revolution that happened. So it's a fascinating film. It's this big, like I said, big epic. We've got Anna Pavlova, who was a famous ballerina. It's the only feature film that they have of hers that she was ever in. I don't know if she ever did anymore. They don't seem to think she did. But she had done the role on stage too, and so she does it for the film. She plays the mute girl at the center of it, and it's interesting. Like, I really love the way that they blend. Like, Lois Weber, she finds ways to blend dancing into this story and still make it feel sort of like you're watching an opera, even though it's not created as an opera at all. It's created as like this linear film with this narrative. It has some just dance numbers, but it's very clearly, a defined film, but it still has these elements where it feels like you're kind of watching an opera. It's very interesting. I liked it.
I'm gonna have to. I mean, I just didn't manage to get around to watching it.
Yeah,
but that sounds interesting because so many of her films that I've seen are the more social issue films, right? Mm-hmm. I think that I'm trying to think of one that's just, more straightforward fictional narrative or a Fantasia or something like that. But
yeah.
Suspense this gets is more in that category.
It's funny because knowing that she spent so much time making social issue films, it makes sense that she would also make this particular film. Like why she would be a good choice to adapt this, because you've got this poor working class town rising up against the nobility, and it is an epic. It's much different from so many of her others in so many ways, but thematically it does still share a lot of connecting material, I guess.
Interesting.
Yeah. So let's talk about the blot.
Let's talk about the blot.
Because you messaged me as soon as you were done watching it, and I don't remember what you said, but it was something very positive, and I was like, oh, I need to watch that, and then I did.
Yeah, so what did you, I loved this film. I was actually surprised by how much I loved it, because I admit that there are a lot of silent films that have an uphill battle with me, particularly dramas. That I sometimes have difficulty focusing, or I'm just like, okay, come on, get on with it. This one, despite the fact that it's a fairly simple story, I found really fascinating and intense. So, but before I go into it, I want to know what you thought.
I also really enjoyed it. I think that the way she introduces each of the characters, and just like, hey, these are these three boys and they are, kind of buttheads, and then introduces each of the members of these families, and I think that, again, talking about shoes and things like that, that's a really clear indication of, wow, this family is really poor. And I think that it does, you've got this family where dad's a teacher and the daughter is working in a library, and they just don't have enough to make ends meet. And you've got this mother who grew up in money, but now she's living without money, and it's really hard for her. And then there's this neighbor who's super judgmental, and yeah, I'm with you where it comes to, like, I love watching silent films that are comedies or melodramas. The dramas are often a little bit more difficult for me, because I find myself like losing focus sometimes. But this one really just kept my attention, and I really enjoyed it. I got so caught up in, like, I was a little distracted by the beginning, because you get introduced to Phil West, who is like one of these three troublemakers at the school, and it says he got by on murder. And I was like, wait, I know this is like 1920s language, but does that mean he actually murdered somebody, or is he just like the kind of kid who could get away with murder? So I was all caught up in that, and like, I'm so confused right now.
Just like, that is an early twist to this film.
Yeah. But as you go along and as you get to know them, I really liked seeing that he's someone who again, like I was talking about before, like as he gets to know, like not just the audience, but as he gets to know these people and see what their life is like, he undergoes a change, a very, very specific change, where he becomes much more empathetic and caring. And it starts with just him having a crush on this girl, but it really becomes something deeper pretty quickly.
Yeah. And I do have to say, so Phil West is played by Louis Calhern, who we may recognize from later films, including Notorious, Alfred Hitchcock's Notorious, and The Asphalt Jungle. Like, he's in a whole bunch of things as a much older man, obviously, but I found it very amusing, actually, to see him. It's just like, he's like 25.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh my God, that's Louis Calhern. He looks exactly the same, but much younger. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a great film. I think it's really well paced, and I said this on Twitter, and I think I may have said to you, just like, I've never been so stressed about a chicken. Like, I am so stressed out about this chicken and what's going to happen with the chicken. and I don't want to spoil too much of the films, people, but there is a plot point, like kind of the climax of the film involves a chicken, and it's intense, but I think that is such a good example of how Weber gets this tension and its emotions into, again, something that's very simple. And so Shoes is about a girl who needs a pair of shoes. This is a little bit more complicated, but the issue of the chicken seems like such a simple thing, but it is so important.
Yeah.
And so much of this film is also just about appearances and about pride, because some of the tension between the Griggs family, who's the professor and his family, and
the Olsons.
The Olsons, yeah, is because Mrs. Olson thinks that they put on airs. And there is this other element of like, so this other family is more successful, right? They make more money. But they're immigrants. There's the implication is that none of them are educated, all of that. So they feel secondary to this other family who is much poorer, but are nonetheless prideful, right? And so there's all of that kind of interesting tension that goes on, but it's also about that they're not really that prideful. They just are embarrassed.
Yeah. Well, and who wants to be like, nobody wants to be a burden on anybody else. And so it's like, even when they desperately need help, they don't want to ask for it, not because they don't need it or don't want anybody to know, but because they just don't want to be a burden on other people. And it really is, it's interesting because it gets into, how terribly paid teachers and professors are. And, because like how, I think Phil actually says it in a letter to his father where he's talking about, that you're entrusting these people with the youth, like with educating the youth, and yet we value what they do for people, but not monetarily. And that's really important. And it's, again, still a conversation we're having today.
Yeah.
100 years later.
And I like the fact that a lot of the film is focused not on the professor himself, but on his family, particularly on the mother and their daughter. And all of those problems that go into it. And also the mother encouraging her daughter to marry Phil or whatever, to kind of be the one, focus on him. And some of it, on the one hand, you're kind of like, well, this is kind of, mercenary, etc. But you also get the sense from the mother that she knows what happens if you marry someone who's poor. And it's not because there's anything wrong with this poor young vicar or anything like that, but that you're going to be poor forever.
Yeah.
And that is wrong, and so she's kind of pushing her daughter in the direction of this rich man, not necessarily because he's a better man, but because she wants her daughter to not have to live in poverty.
Right. But what I love too, we're gonna get into spoiling the movie, but what I love too is that her daughter pushes back on that, not necessarily like vocally, but just by not giving him a lot of attention until she starts to see a change in him. But she's also got these other men that are interested in her too. So she's got a lot of options. So yeah. But
she ultimately falls in love with him, not because he's wealthy, but because he proves himself to be a good man.
Right.
And that goodness is what's important.
Yeah.
And I think that part of the point is that the vicar and the professor, etc., they should not be living on starvation wages. Like, They should have the same kind of money. They should be able, it should be an issue not of, I need to push my daughter to marry this rich guy because otherwise she's going to starve. And more, I want my daughter to marry the person that she loves.
Yeah, exactly. And that's just, that was not the reality for a lot of people. It was,
and still isn't in a lot of ways.
Yeah,
there's still true. And we're, women are much less dependent upon marriage, obviously, in order to survive, for survival. But there is still that kind of calculation that goes on to a certain degree of like, and like we're saying, becoming a teacher, becoming a professor, you are essentially relegating yourself to particular to particular system. And I have friends that are public school teachers, and they are hideously underpaid. And again, and they've been and particularly right now, they've been asked to do all of these things, and keep the kids educated during a pandemic, all of this shit, and they're not getting compensated for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's like, so what's important here?
Yeah, exactly. It's funny that you bring up the pandemic, because I was thinking about the fact that this movie, The Block, came out in 1921, and I was just like, they were still dealing with the pandemic when they were making movies. I wonder how they dealt with it back then.
Yeah, exactly. The last pandemic.
Yeah. And then I thought, man, did they have to like quarantine and isolate during productions? I don't know. Anyway, just a random thought I had. But did you watch Discontent?
I did watch Discontent, yes.
What did you think of Discontent?
I didn't like it as much as the others. I thought I liked the humor in it. One of the things I like about a lot of Lois Weber's films is that even when they're really serious topics, she does tend to get humor into it somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Like The Blot has I like the subplot with the cat.
Yes, I love the cat.
And the cat, and like random kittens that show up every once in a while. It's just like, she's got some kittens now.
Mm-hmm.
But I like the fact that Discontent does have this humor to it, and that the issues at stake are it's really less about money and power, but more about like what actually makes us happy.
Yeah.
And why.
Yeah. So here's what I loved about Discontent is that it's sorry, I'm trying to think how to say this so it makes sense. But it's that whole concept of misery loves company. So basically you've got this old man who's like a war veteran, and I realized, he's like a Civil War veteran. The Civil War was only 50 years before this movie came out.
Yeah, they're all Union soldiers. They're all wearing like the Union uniforms.
Yeah, and that was such a weird realization for me. It was like people were making movies when the Civil War was only as far back in history as like the Nixon administration was for us.
Yeah, it was grandpa, right?
Yeah.
It was your parents or your grandparents' fault.
Yeah. So that was a little weird. But anyway, so it's this old man, he's in this home for, veterans, and he's just mad. The food's not good, the bed's not good, everything's uncomfortable, and his nephew has everything so much better. His nephew's doing well, and the beds at his nephew's house are comfortable, and so he goes and visits, and they end up inviting him to come and live with them, and the nephew and his wife. And so it's like, this is great, our uncle's gonna be here living with us, but he's just such a miserable person that even changing his circumstances and putting him somewhere else that's better, it still doesn't make him happy. And he just like one by one starts making everyone else miserable just because he complains all the time. And then people start thinking about the things that they don't like instead of the things that they do. And eventually he goes back to where it came from, because he realized it was just better, and he didn't have much, but he was happier. And I agree with you that it's not as strong of a film, but I really like that the way that she represents and shows, like, tells this story about, just how a miserable person can make everybody else miserable just by existing.
It is, that is true. I liked the fact that the uncle, he's not trying to make other people miserable. No. He's just like, he says to the son who's studying to be a minister, right? You want to save people's souls, but you never really go out and live and like realize what sin actually is. And then the nephew gets, I guess he would be a great nephew, but he gets into trouble for going out and going to like nightclubs and stuff like that. Because just like, you really shouldn't be doing that. Yeah, he points things out that the family was okay with.
Yeah.
That is then like, oh, maybe that isn't okay. Maybe we should change, and they all become unhappy as a result.
Yeah, he starts to make them he points out things that make them start to become discontented with their lives. It's not that he's trying to make everyone mad or unhappy. It's just because that's where his focus is like on how things could always just, well, let's do this, that'll be better. And so it just causes a lot of discontent.
I like that there's the whole little subplot with the daughter's boyfriend, just like he's too short.
Yes.
Like, he's too short for a woman like you. You need a bigger man because you're a bigger woman. It's like, Jesus Christ. And so she like is breaking up with her boyfriend because it's just like, no, you're too short. You're too short.
Exactly. Yep. It's great. So, and then at the end, it ends with the title card that says, "Are you discontent?" So it's turning it back on the audience. Are you? Or are you this, happy person? So anyway, I like that. I liked it. I think The Blot, out of the ones that I watched, I think The Blot was the best one. But yeah. Any others you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I'd agree with that. No, I actually just wanted to mention, because you talked about the sex scene, apparently, which I now definitely have to see this movie. In The Dumb Girl of Portici. Lois Weber also, I think, takes credit for the first full frontal female nudity in a film, for the film Hypocrites, that there is actually a sequence where it is like a full frontal female nudity. So I think that, guys, you have a woman to thank for this.
There you go.
So.
Cool.
Yeah, I think she's just a fantastic director. She, as we've said, there were a lot of innovations that she accomplished, and also just being able to tell stories. So this ability to create suspense and tension over things that seem to be fairly minor, but that become so important, and how important they are to the lives of real people. That issue of the difference between life and death could be a pair of shoes. And I think that there's so much meaning in that, and that she's able to convey that on screen in a way that is difficult. Like, she's a good director when you really come down to it. It isn't just that she's this major female director, she is a great director.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the thing that I really would love us to get to the point where we don't have to separate directors by male and female, because again, like we said, it's not a gendered job. It's something that anybody can do. And there are lots of great directors, and Lois Weber is one of them.
Yeah.
We have a lot, like even today, we have a lot in film to thank her for from, so many years ago. Any final thoughts?
No final thoughts on that. Yeah, just like I would encourage people to go, like, if you have the Criterion Channel, go and watch the films that are on there, because my personal favorite, I think, is The Blot. But everything that she made definitely has value. I do also encourage people to seek out Where Are My Children, just because I think it's an interesting film. It's uncomfortable in a lot of ways, and this is not an endorsement of everything that it portrays, but I think that it's important that one of the earliest films to deal with very explicitly with the topic of abortion was made by a woman.
Yeah, exactly. I was just looking up, let's see. So in addition to The Blot, Suspense, Shoes, Discontent, and The Dumb Girl of Portici, however you say that, the other film that's streaming right now is Hypocrites, which is available on Canopy. So there you go. The rest of them are just kind of not available. Some films a lot of her films are lost or were destroyed intentionally, just because that was what they did. Oh, we don't need these films anymore, let's burn them. And so a lot of stuff is just gone forever, and that's sad. But
I do know that a couple of her later films, later in the 1920s, are available on Blu-ray. check out Kino's pioneering women filmmakers. I want to say, I would have to look at the discs again, but I want to say that those actually have some of the fragments that still survive from some of her different films, some of her shorts, and the two films that I know are coming out on Kino, or I think that are already out on Kino, and I need to write my reviews, are Sensation Seekers and A Chapter in Her Life, which are later films. They're produced by Carl Laemmle. But they're later films post Lois Weber Productions, and still silent, but they are also available to watch.
Very cool. Thank you. All right. So I think that's going to wrap things up for this week. Unless you wanted to talk about any current movies.
I think that I'm okay. I don't want to make myself unpopular, and I acknowledge the fact that I am a very white lady, so I will leave things as they are for now.
I'm glad people are happy.
Yes, they should be happy.
Yep. Don't be discontent. All right, so that's going to close things off for this week then. We would like to thank you all for listening, and we would especially like to thank our patrons who help keep the show going, with special shout out to Adriana, Ollie, Heather, James, Kathleen, Carriata, Mason, Matt, Matthew, Michelle, Monty, Nanina, Robert, Steve, Sharon, Tao, and Will. Thank you so much for your support. If you would like to join them, you can go to patreon.com/citizendame and sign up, where you get access to full bonus episodes. You get early access to the show. You get lots of other fun stuff that's coming your way. And more stuff that we're planning very soon in the near future. We also have our Zazzle store, zazzle.com/citizendamepod. You can get shirts and masks and all kinds of fun stuff. And we have our Ko-Fi, which is ko-fi.com/citizendame. You can contact us directly if you'd like to at our email, which is citizendamepod@gmail.com. And be sure to check out our website, citizendamepod.com, where we will both be having some Tribeca stuff coming very soon, and some other goodies. So you can also find us on the social medias. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd. Well, Twitter and Instagram is at CitizenDamePod. Letterboxd, we're at CitizenDame. We're working on that one. It's still really new, but we're going to be creating some lists and fun things there on Letterboxd too. So but you can also find us individually. Lauren, where are you?
I am on Twitter and Instagram and Letterboxd at LH Business.
And I am on Twitter, Instagram, and Letterboxd at Karen M. Peterson. Thanks as always for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
That's good. I'm going to level with you. We can't get married at all.
Why not?
Well, in the first place, I'm not a natural blonde.
Doesn't matter.
I smoke. I smoke all the time.
I don't care.
Well, I have a terrible past. For 3 years now, I've been living with a saxophone player.
I forgive you.
I can never have children.
We can adopt some.
But you don't understand, Osgood. I'm a man.
Well, nobody's perfect.